All right. Wonder how well this is working. Is my microphone all right? Testing, testing. Okay, it's louder if I do that. Um, yeah, it's probably kind of quiet. Okay. Um, yeah, I guess this is good. All right. So this book is called The Backwoods of Canada. It is by Catharine Traill, and it is a collection of letters from the years 1832 through 1834. And it's written by a woman who comes from Britain with her husband, and they both sail together across the Atlantic, and they arrive in Canada, I believe, in Quebec, and they go off and live on the frontier. So I don't know how much I will get through today, but I will just start from the first letter and see how far it goes. All right. Letter 1. Departure from Greenock in brig Laurel. Fitting up of the vessel. Boy passenger. Sea prospect. Want of occupation and amusement. Captain's Goldfinch. So that's like the subheading for the letter that the compiler gave. Yes, so Brig Laurel, July 18th, 1832. I received your last kind letter, my dearest mother, only a few hours before we set sail from Greenock. As you express a wish that I should give you a minute's detail of our voyage, I shall take up my subject from the time of our embarkation, and write as inclination prompts me. Instead of having reason to complain of short letters, you will, I fear, find mine only too prolix. After many delays and disappointments, we succeeded at last in obtaining a passage in a fast-sailing brig, the Laurel, of Greenock, and favorable winds are now rapidly carrying us across the Atlantic. The Laurel is not a regular passenger ship, which I consider an advantage, for what we lose in amusement and variety, we assuredly gain in comfort. The cabin is neatly fitted up, and I enjoy the luxury, for such it is, compared with the narrow berths of the state cabin, of a handsome sofa, with crimson draperies, in the great cabin. The state cabin is also ours. We paid £15 each for our passage to Montreal. This was high, but it includes every expense, and in fact we had no choice. The only vessel in the river bound for Canada was a passenger ship, literally swarming with emigrants, chiefly of the lower class of Highlanders. The only passengers besides ourselves in the Laurel are the captain's nephew, a pretty yellow-haired lad, about 15 years of age, who works his passage out, and a young gentleman who is going out as a clerk in a merchant's house in Quebec. He seems too much wrapped up in his own affairs to be very communicative to others. He walks much, talks little, and reads less, but often amuses himself by singing as he paces the deck, "Home, Sweet Home," and that delightful song by Camoens, "Isle of Beauty." It is a sweet song, and I can easily imagine the charm it has for a homesick heart. I was much pleased with the scenery of the Clyde. The day we set sail was a lovely one, and I remained on deck till nightfall. The morning light found our vessel dashing gallantly along with a favorable breeze through the North Channel. That day we saw the last of the Hebrides, and before night lost sight of the north coast of Ireland. A wide expanse of water and sky is now our only prospect, unvaried by any object save the distant and scarcely to be traced outline of some vessel just seen at the verge of the horizon, a speck in the immensity of space, or sometimes a few seafowl. I love to watch these wanderers of the ocean as they rise and fall with the rocking billows or flit about our vessel, and often I wonder whence they came, to what distant shore they are bound, and if they make the rude wave their home and resting place during the long day and dark night. And then I recall to mind the words of the American poet Bryant: "He who from zone to zone guides through the boundless air at their certain flight, and the long way that I must tread alone will guide my steps aright. Though we have been little more than a week on board, I'm getting weary of the voyage. I can only compare the monotony of it to being weatherbound in some country inn. I have already made myself acquainted with all the books worth reading in the ship's library. Unfortunately, it is chiefly made up with old novels and musty romances. When the weather is fine, I sit on a bench on the deck, wrapped in my cloak, and sew or pace the deck with my husband, and talk over plans for the future, which in all probability will never be realized. I really do pity men who are not actively employed. Women have always their needle as a resource against the overwhelming weariness of an idle life, but where a man is confined to a small space such as the deck and cabin of a trading vessel, with nothing to see, nothing to hear, nothing to do, and nothing to read, he is really a very pitiable creature. There is one passenger on board that seems perfectly happy, if one may judge from the liveliness of the songs with which he greets us whenever we approach his cage. It is Harry, the captain's goldfinch, or the captain's mate, as the sailors term him. This pretty creature has made no fewer than 12 voyages in the Laurel. It is all one to him whether his cage is at sea or on land. He is still at home, said the captain, regarding his little favorite with an air of great affection, and evidently gratified by the attention I bestowed on his bird. I have already formed a friendship with the little captive. He never fails to greet my approach with one of his sweetest songs, and will take from my fingers a bit of biscuit, which he holds in his claws till he has thanked me with a few of his clearest notes. This mark of acknowledgment is turned by the steward, saying grace. If the wind still continues to favor us, the captain tells us we shall be on the banks of Newfoundland in another week. Farewell for the present. And that was letter one. So now on to letter two. And this one is titled Arrival off Newfoundland. Brig Laurel, River St. Lawrence, August 6th, 1832. I left off writing, my dear mother, from this simple cause. I had nothing to say. One day was but the echo, as it were, of the one that preceded it, so that a page copied from the mate's log would have proved as amusing, and to the full as instructive as my journal, provided I had kept one during the last fortnight. So barren of events has that time been that the sight of a party of bottle-nosed whales, 2 or 3 seals, and a porpoise, possibly on their way to a dinner or tea party at the North Pole, was considered an occurrence of great importance. Every glass was in requisition as soon as they made their appearance, and the marine monsters were well nigh stared out of countenance. We came within sight of the shores of Newfoundland on the 5th of August, just 1 month from the day we took our last look of the British Isles. Yet though the coast was brown and rugged and desolate, I hailed its appearance with rapture. Never did anything seem so refreshing and delicious to me as the land breeze that came to us, as I thought, bearing health and gladness on its wings. I had noticed with some curiosity the restless activity of the captain's bird some hours previous to land being proclaimed from the lookout station. He sang continually, and his note was longer, clearer, and more thrilling than heretofore. The little creature, the captain assured me, was conscious of the difference in the air as we approached the land. I trust almost as much to my bird as to my glass, he said, and have never yet been deceived. Our progress was somewhat tedious after we entered the Gulf. 90 miles across is the entrance of this majestic river. It seems an ocean in itself. Half our time is spent poring over the great chart in the cabin, which is constantly being rolled and unrolled by my husband to gratify my desire of learning the names of the distant shores and islands which we pass. We are without a pilot as yet, and the captain, being a cautious seaman, is unwilling to risk the vessel on this dangerous navigation, so that we proceed but slowly on our voyage. August 7th. We visited this we visited this morning by a beautiful we were visited this morning by a beautiful little bird, not much larger than our gold-crested wren. I hailed it as a bird of good omen, a little messenger sent to bid us welcome to the new world, and I felt almost a childish joy at the sight of our little visitor. There are happy moments in our lives when we draw the greatest pleasure from the most trifling sources, as children are pleased with the most simple toy. From the hour we entered the Gulf, a perceptible change had taken place in all on board. The captain, a man of grave, quiet manners, grew quite talkative. My husband was more than usually animated, and even the thoughtful young Scotchman became positively an entertaining person. The crew displayed the most lively zeal in the performance of their duty, and the goldfinch sung cheerily from dawn till sunset. As for me, hope was busy in my heart, chasing from it all feelings of doubt or regret that might sadden the present or cloud the future. I am now able to trace distinctly the outline of the coast on the southern side of the river. Sometimes the highlands are suddenly enveloped in dense clouds of mist, which are in constant motion, rolling along in shadowy billows, now tinted with rosy light, now white and fleecy, or bright as silver, as they catch the sunbeams. So rapid are the changes that take place in this fog bank, that perhaps the next time I raise my eyes, I behold the scene changed as if by magic. The misty curtain is slowly drawn up, as if by invisible hands, and the wild, wooded mountains partially revealed, with their bold rocky shores and sleeping bays. At other times, the vapory volume, dividing, moves along the valleys in deep ravines, like lofty pillars of smoke, or hangs in snowy draperies among the dark forest pines. I am never we- I am never re- I am never weary of watching these fantastic clouds. They recall to me the pleasant time I spent in the highlands, among the cloud-capped hills of the north. As yet, the air is cold, and we experience frequent squalls of wind and hail, with occasional peals of thunder. Then again, all is serene and bright, and the air is filled with fragrance, and flies and bees and birds come flitting past us from the shore. August 8th. Though I cannot but dwell with feelings of wonder and admiration on the majesty and power of this mighty river, I begin to grow weary of its immensity, and long for a nearer view of the shore. But at present we see nothing more than long lines of pine-clad hills, with here and there a white speck, which they tell me are settlements and villages to the south, while huge mountains divested of verdure bound our great view on the north side of the river. My admiration of mountainous scenery makes me dwell with more interest on the side of the river, and I watch the progress of cultivation among these rugged and inhospitable regions with positive pleasure. During the last 2 days, we have been anxiously looking out for a pilot to take us up to Quebec. Various signals have been fired, but hitherto without success. No pilot has condescended to visit us, so we are somewhat in the condition of a stage without a coachman, with only some inexperienced hand to hold the reins. I already perceived some manifestations of impatience appearing among us, but no one blames the captain, who is very anxious about the matter, as the river is full of rocks and shoals, and presents many difficulties to a person not intimately acquainted with the navigation. Besides, he is answerable for the safety of the ship to the underwriters in case he neglects to take a pilot on board. While writing the above, I was roused by a bustle on deck, and going up to learn the cause, was informed that a boat with the long looked for pilot had put off from the shore. But, after all the fuss and bustle, it proved only a French fisherman, with a poor ragged lad, his assistant. The captain with very little difficulty persuaded Monsieur Paul Breton to pilot us as far as Green Island, a distance of some 100 miles higher up the river, where he assured us we should meet with a regular pilot, if not before. I have some little difficulty in understanding Monsieur Paul, as he speaks a peculiar accent, a peculiar dialect, but he seems good-natured and obliging enough. He tells us the corn is yet green, hardly in ear, and the summer fruits not yet ripe. But he says that at Quebec we shall find apples and fruit in plenty. As we advance higher up the river, the country on both sides begins to assume a more genial aspect. Patches of verdure, with white cottages, are seen on the shores and scattered along the sides of the mountains, while here and there a village church rears its simple spire, distinguished above the surrounding buildings by its glittering vane and bright roof of tin. The southern shores are more populous but less picturesque than those of the north, but there is enough on either side to delight the eye. This morning we anchored off the Isle of Bic, a pretty low island, covered with trees and looking very pleasant. I felt a longing desire to set my foot on Canadian ground and must own I was a little disappointed when the captain advised me to remain on board and not attempt to make one of the party that were preparing to go on shore. My husband seconded the captain's wish, so I contented myself with leaning over the ship's side and feasting my eyes on the rich masses of foliage as they waved to and fro with the slight breeze that agitated them. I had soon reason to be thankful that I had not followed my own wayward will, for the afternoon proved foggy, and on the return of the boat I learned that the ground was swampy just where the party landed, and they sunk over their ankles in water. They reported the island to be covered knee-deep with the most luxuriant growth of red clover, tall trees, low shrubs, and an abundance of wild flowers. That I might not regret not accompanying him, my husband brought me a delightful bouquet, which he had selected for me. Among the flowers were fragrant red roses, resembling those we call Scotch burnet-leaved, with smooth shining leaves and few if any thorns. The blue flower, called pulmonaria, or lugwort, which I gathered in the highlands. A sweet pea, with red blossoms and wreaths of lovely pale green foliage. A white orchid, the smell of which was quite delicious. Besides these were several small white and yellow flowers, with which I was totally unacquainted. The steward furnished me with a china jar and fresh water, so that I shall have the pleasure of a nosegay during the rest of the voyage. The sailors had not forgotten a green bow or two to adorn the ship, and the birdcage was soon as bowery as leaves could make it. Though the weather is now very fine, we make but slow progress. The provoking wind seems determined to blow from every quarter but the right. We float up with the flood tide, and when the tide fails, cast anchor, and wait with the best grace we can till it is time to weigh anchor again. I amuse myself with examining the villages and settlements through the captain's glass, or watching for the appearance of white porpoises tumbling through the waves. These creatures are of a milky whiteness, and have nothing of the disgusting look of the black ones. Sometimes a seal pops its droll head up close beside our vessel, looking very much like Sinbad's little old man of the sea. It is unfortunate for me that my love of natural history enables me to draw amusement from objects that are deemed by many unworthy of attention. To me, they present an inexhaustible fund of interest. The simplest weed that grows in my path, or the fly that flutters about me, are subjects for reflection, admiration, and delight. We are now within sight of Green Island. It is the largest and I believe one of the most populous we have passed. Every minute now seems to increase the beauty of the passage. Far as the eye can reach, you see the shore thronged with villages and farms in one continuous line. On the northern side, all are gay and glittering with the tin roofs on the most important buildings. The rest are shingles, whitewashed. This I do not like so well as the plain shingled roofs. The whiteness of the roofs of the cottages and homesteads have a glaring effect, and we look in vain for that relief to the eye that is produced by the thatched or slated roofs. The shingles in their natural state soon acquire the appearance of slates, and can hardly be distinguished from them. What would you say to a rose-colored house with a roof of the same gaudy hue, the front of the gay edifice being garnished with grass-green shutters, doors, and veranda? No doubt the interior is furnished with corresponding taste. There is generally one or more of these smart buildings in a Canadian village, standing forth with ostentatious splendor above its more modest brethren. August 11th. Just below Green Island, we took on board a real pilot, who, by the way, I do not like half so well as Monsieur Paul. He is a little bit pragmatical, and seems evidently proud of his superior knowledge of the river. The good-natured fisherman relinquished his post with a very good grace, and seems already excellent friends with his more able rival. For my part, I was very sorry when the new pilot came on board. The first thing he did was to hand us over a pamphlet containing regulations from the Board of Health at Quebec, respecting the cholera, which is raging, he tells us, like a fearful plague, both at that place and Montreal. These regulations positively forbid the captain and the pilot to allow any person, whether of the crew or passengers, to quit the vessel until they shall have passed examination at the quarantine ground, under the risk of incurring a severe penalty. This was very annoying, as the captain that very morning had proposed taking us on shore at a lovely spot called Crane Island, to spend the afternoon while we waited for the return of the tide at the house of a Scotch gentleman, the owner of the prettiest settlement I had yet seen, the buildings and grounds being laid out with great taste. The situation of this island is of itself very beautiful. Around it are the waters of the St. Lawrence, bearing on its mighty current the commerce of several nations. In the foreground are the populous and lively settlements of the northern shores, while behind and far above it rise the lofty range of mountains to the north, now studded with rural villages, pleasant farms, and cultivated fields. The island itself showed us smooth lawns and meadows of emerald verdure, with orchard with with orchards and cornfields sloping down to the water's edge. After a confinement of nearly 5 weeks on board, you may easily suppose with what satisfaction we contemplated the prospect of spending a few hours on this inviting spot. We expect to reach the quarantine ground, Gross Isle, this evening, where the pilot says we shall be detained 3 days. Though we are all in good health, yet, having sailed from an infected port, we shall be detained on the quarantine ground, but not allowed to land. August 12th. We reached Gross Isle yesterday evening. It is a beautiful rocky island covered with the groves of beech, birch, ash, and fir trees. There are several vessels lying at anchor close to the shore. One bears the melancholy symbol of disease, the yellow flag. She is a passenger ship and has the smallpox and measles among her crew. When any infectious complaint appears on board, the yellow flag is hoisted, and the invalids conveyed to the cholera hospital or wooden building that has been erected on a rising bank above the shore. It is surrounded with palisades and a guard of soldiers. There is also a temporary fort at some distance from the hospital, containing a garrison of soldiers who are there to enforce the quarantine rules. These rules are considered as very defective, and in some respects quite absurd, and are productive of many severe evils to the unfortunate immigrants. While the passengers and crew of a vessel do not exceed a certain When the passengers and crew of a vessel do not exceed a certain number, they are not allowed to land under a they are not allowed to land under a penalty both to the captain and to the offender. But if on the contrary they should exceed the stated number, ill or well, passengers and crew must all turn out and go on shore, taking with them their bedding and clothes, which are all spread out on the shore, to be washed, aired, and fumigated, giving the healthy every chance of taking the infection from the invalids. The sheds and buildings put up for the accommodation of those who are obliged to submit to the quarantine laws are in the same area as the hospital. Nothing can exceed the longing desire I feel to be allowed to land and explore this picturesque island. The weather is so fine, and the waving groves of green, the little rocky bays and inlets of the island appear so tempting. But to all my entreaties, the visiting surgeon who came on board returned a decided negative. A few hours after his visit, however, an Indian basket containing strawberries and raspberries with a large bunch of wildflowers was sent on board for me with the surgeon's compliments. I amused myself with making little sketches of the fort and the surrounding scenery, or watching the groups of emigrants on shore. We have already seen the landing of the passengers of 3 emigrant ships. You may imagine yourself looking on a fair or crowded market, clothes waving in the wind or spread out on the earth, chests, bundles, baskets, men, women, and children, asleep or basking in the sun, some in motion, busied with their goods, the women employed in washing or cooking in the open air, beside the wood fires on the beach, while parties of children are pursuing each other in wanton glee, rejoicing in their newly acquired liberty. Mixed with these, you see the stately form and gay trappings of the sentinels, while the thin blue smoke of the wood fires rising above the trees heightens the picture and gives it an additional effect. On my husband remarking the picturesque appearance of the scene before us to one of the officers from the fort who had come on board, he smiled sadly and replied, "Believe me, in this instance, as in many others, 'tis distance lends enchantment to the view. Could you take a nearer sur- could you take a nearer survey of some of those very picturesque groups which you admire? I think you would turn away from them with heart sickness. You would there behold every variety of disease, vice, poverty, filth, and famine, human misery, in its most disgusting and saddening form. Such pictures as Hogarth's pencil only could have portrayed, or Crabbe's pen described. August 14th. We are once more underway and floating up the river with the tide. Gros, Gros Isle is just 25 miles below Quebec. A favorable breeze would carry us up in a few hours. As it is, we can only make a little way by tacking from side to side when we lose the tide. I rather enjoy this way of proceeding, as it gives one a close view of both sides of the river, which narrows considerably as we approach nearer towards Quebec. Tomorrow, if no accident happens, we shall be anchored in front of a place rendered interesting both by its historical associations and its own native beauty of situation. Till tomorrow, then, adieu. I was reckoning much on seeing the falls of Montmorency, which are within sight of the river, but the sun set and the stars rose brilliantly before we approached within sound of the cataract. And though I strained my eyes till they were weary of gazing on the dim, shadowy scene around me, I could distinguish nothing beyond the dark masses of rock that forms the channel through which the waters of the Montmorency rush into the St. Lawrence. At 10 last night, August the 15th, the lights of the city of Quebec were seen gleaming through the distance, like a coronet of stars above the waters. At 10:30, we dropped anchor opposite the fort, and I fell asleep dreaming of the various scenes through which I had passed. Again, I was destined to be disappointed in my expectations of going on shore. The visiting surgeon advised my husband and me by no means to land, as the mortality that still raged in the town made it very hazardous. He gave a melancholy description of the place: desolation and woe and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children because they are not, are words that may well be applied to the city of the pestilence. Nothing can be more imposing than the situation of Quebec, built on the sides and summit of a magnificent rock, on the highest point of which, Cape Diamond, stands the fortress overlooking the river, and commanding a most superb view of the surrounding scenes. I did indeed regret the loss of this noble prospect, the equal of which I suppose I shall never see. It would have been something to have thought on and recalled in after years, when buried in the solitude of the Canadian woods. The opposite heights, being the Pont-Levis side, are highly picturesque, though less imposing than the rock on which the town stands. The bank is rocky, precipitous, and clothed with trees that sweep down to the water's edge, excepting where they are cleared away to give place to white cottages, gardens, and hanging orchards. But, in my opinion, much less is done with this romantic situation than might be effected if good taste were exercised in the buildings and on the disposal of the ground. How lovely would such a spot be rendered in England or Scotland! Nature here has done all, and man but little, excepting sticking up some ugly wooden cottages, as mean as they are tasteless. It is, however, very possible there may be pretty villas and houses higher up, that are concealed from the eye by the intervening groves. The river is considered to be just a mile across from Point Levy to the landing stairs below the custom house in Quebec, and it was a source of amusement to me to watch the horse ferry boats that ply between the two shores. The captain told me there were not less than 12 of these comical-looking machines. They each have their regular hours, so that you see a constant succession going or returning. They carry a strange assortment of passengers, well and ill-dressed, old and young, rich and poor, cows, sheep, horses, pigs, dogs, fowls, market baskets, vegetables, fruit, hay, corn, anything and everything you will see by turns. The boat is flat, railed round, with a wicker at each end to admit the live and dead stock that go or are taken on board. The center of the boat, if such it can be called, is occupied by four lean, ill-favored hacks, who walk round and round, as if in a threshing machine, and work the paddles at each side. There is a sort of pen for the cattle. I am told there is a monument erecting in honor of Wolfe in the governor's garden, looking towards the St. Lawrence, and to be seen from Point Levy. The inscription has not yet been decided upon. The captain has just returned from the town. He very kindly brought on board a basket of ripe apples for me, besides fresh meat, vegetables, bread, butter, and milk. The deck is all bustle, with custom house officers and men unloading a part of the ship's freight, which consists chiefly of rum, brandy, sugar, and coals for ballast. We are to leave Quebec by 5 o'clock this morning. The British America, a superb steam vessel of 3 decks, takes us in tow as far as Montreal. I must now say farewell. Okay, that was letter 2. Now we are at letter 3. And this one is titled, let's see, Departure from Quebec. Brig Laurel, St. Lawrence, below Montreal, August 17th, 1832. It was after sunset and a glorious evening when we left Quebec, which we did in company with a fine steam vessel whose decks and gallery were crowded with passengers of all descriptions. A brave sight she was to look upon, ploughing the bright waters which foamed and sung beneath her paddles, while our brig, with her white sails, followed like a butterfly in her wake. The heavens were glowing with the richest tints of rose and saffron, which were reflected below on the bosom of the river, and then came forth the stars in the soft blue ether, more brilliant than ever I saw them at home, and this I suppose I may attribute to the superior purity of the atmosphere. I may attribute, not attribute. My husband said this evening resembled the sunsets of Italy. My husband said this evening resembled the sunsets of Italy. Our voyage has proved a very pleasant one, the weather moderately warm and the air quite clear. We have within the last few days emerged from a cold, damp atmosphere, such as we often experience in Britain in the spring, to a delightful summer, moderated by light breezes from the river. The further we advance up the country, the more fertile it appears. The harvest is ripening under a more genial climate than that below Quebec. We see fields of Indian corn in full flower. It is a stately looking crop, with its beautiful feathery top tinted with a rich purple hue, below which tufts of pale green silk are waving in the breeze. When fully ripe, they tell me it is beautiful to see the golden grain bursting from its silvery sheath, but that it is a crop liable to injury from frost, and has many enemies, such as bears, raccoons, squirrels, mice, fowls, etc. We saw several fields of tobacco along the banks of the river, which looked very healthy and flourishing. I believe tobacco is cultivated to some extent in both provinces, but the Canadian tobacco is not held in such high esteem as that of Virginia. There is a flourishing and very pretty town situated at the junction of the Richelieu River with the St. Lawrence, formerly called Sorel, now called Fort William Henry. The situation is excellent. There are several churches, a military fort with mills, and other public buildings with some fine stone houses. The land, however, in the immediate vicinity of the town seems very light and sandy. I was anxious to obtain a near view of a log house or a shanty, and was somewhat disappointed in the few buildings of this kind that I saw along the banks of the river. It was not the rudeness of the material so much as the bark-like form of the buildings of this kind, and the little attention that was paid to the picturesque, that displeased me. In Britain, even the peasant has taste enough to plant a few roses or honeysuckles about his door or his casement, and there's and there and there is the little bit of garden enclosed and neatly kept. But here, no such attempt is made to the ornament of the no such attempt is made to ornament the cottages. We saw no smiling orchard or grove to conceal the bare log walls, and as to the little farmhouses, they are uglier still, and look so pert and ungraceful, stuck upon the bank close to the water's edge. Further back, a different style of building and cultivation appears. The farms and frame houses are really handsome places, and in good taste, with clumps of trees here and there to break the monotony of the clearing. The land is nearly one unbroken level plain, apparently fertile and well farmed, but too flat for fine scenery. The country between Quebec and Montreal has all the appearance of having been under a long state of cultivation, especially on the right bank of the river. Still, there is a great portion of forest standing which it will take years of labor to remove. We passed some little grassy islands on which there were many herds of cattle feeding. I was puzzling myself to know how they got there, when the captain told me it was usual for farmers to convey their stock to these island pastures in flat-bottomed boats or to swim them, if the place was fordable, and leave them to graze as long as the food continued good. If cows are put in an island within a reasonable distance of the farm, some person goes daily in a canoe to milk them. While he was telling me this, a log canoe with a boy and a stout lass with tin pails paddled across the bank of the river and proceeded to call together their herd. We noticed some very pleasant rural villages to the right as we advanced, but our pilot was stupid and could not or would not tell their names. It was Sunday morning, and we could just hear the quick tinkling of the church bells and distinguish long lines of caliches, light wagons with equestrians and pedestrians hastening along the avenue of trees that led to the churchyard. Besides these were boats and canoes crossing the river, bound to the same peaceful haven. In a part of the St. Lawrence, where the channel is rendered difficult by shoals and sandbanks, there occur little lighthouses, looking somewhat like miniature watermills, on wooden posts raised above the flat banks on which they are built. These droll little huts were inhabited, and we noticed a merry party in their holiday clothes enjoying a gossip with a party in a canoe below them. They looked clean and smart, and cheerful enough, but I did not envy them their situation, which I should think far from healthy. Some miles below Montreal, the appearance of the country became richer, more civilized, and populous, while the distant line of the Blue Mountains at the verge of the horizon added an interest to the landscape. The rich tint of ripening harvest formed a beautiful contrast with the azure sky and waters of the St. Lawrence. The scenery of the river near Montreal is of a very different character to that below Quebec. The latter possesses a wild and rugged aspect, and its productions are evidently those of a colder and less happy climate. What the former loses in grandeur and picturesque effect, it gains in fertility of soil and warmth of temperature. In the lower division of the province, you feel that the industry of the inhabitants is forcing a churlish soil for bread, while in the upper, the land seems willing to yield her increase to a moderate exertion. Remember, these are merely the cursory remarks of a passing traveler, and founded on no personal experience. There was a feeling of anxiety and dread upon our minds that we would hardly acknowledge to each other as we drew near the city of the pestilence, as if ashamed of confessing a weakness that was felt, but no one spoke on the subject. With what unmixed delight and admiration at any other time should we have gazed With what unmixed delight and admiration at any other time should we have gazed on the scene that opened upon us. The river here expands into a fine extensive basin, diversified with islands, on the largest of which Montreal is situated. The lofty hill from which the town takes its name rises like a crown above it, and forms a singular and magnificent feature in the landscape, reminding me of some of the detached hills in the vicinity of Inverness. Opposite to the Quebec suburbs, just in front of the rapids, is situated the island of St. Helens, a spot of infinite loveliness. The center of it is occupied by a grove of lofty trees, while the banks, sloping down to the water, seem of the most verdant turf. The scene was heightened by the appearance of the troops which garrisoned the island. The shores of the river, studded with richly cultivated farms, the village of La Prairie, with the little island of St. Anne's in the distance, the glittering steeples and roofs of the city, with its gardens and villas, look lovely by the softening glow of a Canadian summer sunset. The church bells ringing for evening prayer, with the hum of voices from the shore, mingled not inharmoniously with the rush of the rapids. These rapids are caused by a descent in the bed of the river. In some places, this declination is gradual, in others sudden and abrupt. When the current is broken by masses of limestone or granite rock, as at the Cascades, the Cedars, and the long salt. It creates whirlpools and cataracts. But the rapids below Montreal are not of this magnificent character, being made perceptible only by the unusual swiftness of the water, and its surface being disturbed by foam, and waving lines and dimples. In short, I was disappointed in my expectation of seeing something very grand, and was half angry at these pretty behaved quiet rapids, to the foot of which we were towed in good style by our faithful consort, the British America. As the captain is uncertain how long we may be detained at Montreal, I shall send this letter without further delay, and write again as soon as possible. That was letter 3. Alright, I guess we can do letter 4. Letter 4. Landing at Montreal. Nelson Hotel, Montreal, August 21st. Once more on terra firma, dearest mother. What a strange sensation it is to tread the land once again, free from the motion of the heaving waters, to which I was now, in truth, glad to bid farewell. By daybreak, every creature on board was up and busily preparing for going on shore. The captain himself obligingly escorted us, and walked as far with us as the hotel, which we are at present lodged. We found some difficulty in getting on shore, owing to the badness of the landing. The river was full of floating timbers, between which it required some skill to guide the boat. A wharf is now being built, not before it was needed. We were struck by the dirty, narrow, ill-paved or unpaved streets of the suburbs, and overpowered by the noisome vapor arising from a deep open fosse that ran along the street behind the wharf. This ditch seemed the receptacle for every abomination, and sufficient in itself to infect a whole town with malignant fevers. I was greatly disappointed in my first acquaintance with the interior of Montreal, a place of which travelers had said so much. I could compare it only to the fruits of the Dead Sea, which are said to be fair and tempting to look upon, but yield only ashes and bitterness when tasted by the thirsty traveler. I noticed one peculiar feature in the buildings along the suburb facing the river, that they were mostly furnished with broad wooden balconies, from the lower to the upper story. In some instances, they surrounded the houses on 3 sides, and seemed to form a sort of outer chamber. Some of these balconies were ascended by flights of broad stairs from the outside. I remember when a child dreaming of houses so constructed, and fancying them very delightful. And so I think they might be rendered, if shaded by climbing shrubs and adorned with flowers, to represent a hanging garden or a sweet-scented bowery walk. But nothing of this kind gladdened our eyes as we toiled along the hot streets. Every house of public resort was crowded from the top to the bottom with emigrants of all ages, English, Irish, and Scotch. The sounds of riotous merriment that burst from them seemed but ill assorted with the haggard, careworn faces of many of the thoughtless revellers. The contrast was only too apparent and too painful a subject to those that looked upon this show of outward gaiety and inward misery. The cholera had made awful ravages, and its devastating effects were to be seen in the darkened dwellings and the mourning habiliments of all classes. An expression of dejection and anxiety appeared in the faces of the few persons we encountered, and I walked to the hotel, which plainly indicated the state of their minds. In some situations, whole streets had been nearly depopulated. Those that those that were able fled panic stricken to the country villages, while others remained to die in the bosom of their families. To no class, I am told, has the disease proved so fatal as to the poorer sort of emigrants. Many of these, debilitated by the privations and fatigue of a long voyage, on reaching Quebec or Montreal, indulged in every sort of excess, especially the dangerous one of intoxication, and, as if purposely paving the way to certain destruction, they fell immediate victims to the complaint. In one house, 11 persons died, in another 17. A little child of 7 years old was the only creature left to tell the woeful tale. This poor desolate orphan, was taken by the nuns to their benevolent institution, where every attention was paid that humanity could suggest. The number both of Catholic and Protestant benevolent societies is very great, and these are maintained with the liberality of principle that does honor to both parties, who seem indeed actuated by a fervent spirit of Christian charity. I know of no place, not even excepting London itself, where the exercise of benevolent feelings is more called for than in these two cities, Quebec and Montreal. Here meet together the unfortunate, the improvident, the helpless orphan, the sick, the aged, the poor virtuous man, driven by the stern hand of necessity from his country and his home, perhaps to be overtaken by sickness or want in a land of strangers. It is melancholy to reflect that a great number of the poorest class of emigrants that perished in the reign of the cholera have left no trace by which their sorrowing, anxious friends in the old country may learn their fate. The disease is so sudden and so violent that it leaves no time for arranging worldly matters. The sentinel comes, not as it did to Hezekiah, set thine house in order, for thou shalt die and not live. The weather is sultry hot, accompanied by frequent thunder showers, which have not the effect one would expect, that of cooling the heated atmosphere. I experienced a degree of languor and oppression that is very distressing, and worse than actual pain. Instead of leaving this place by the first conveyance for the upper province, as we fully purposed doing, we find ourselves obliged to remain 2 days longer, owing to the dilatoriness of the custom house officers in overlooking our packages. The fact is that everything and everybody are out of sorts. The heat has been too oppressive to allow any of my walking much abroad. I have seen but little of the town beyond the streets adjacent to the hotel, with the exception of the Catholic cathedral. With the exception of the Catholic cathedral, I have seen few of the public buildings. With the former I was much pleased. It is a fine building, though still in an unfinished state, the towers not having been carried to the height originally intended. The eastern window, behind the altar, is 70 feet in height by 30 feet in width. The effect of this magnificent window from the entrance, the altar with its adornments and paintings, the several smaller altars and shrines, all decorated with scriptural designs, the light years of galleries that surround the central part of the church, the double range of columns supporting the vaulted ceiling, and the arched windows, all combined to form one beautiful whole. What most pleased me was the extreme lightness of the architecture. Though I thought the imitation of marble with which the pillars were painted coarse and glaring, we missed the time-hollowing mellowness that ages bestowed on our ancient churches and cathedrals. The grim corbels and winged angels that are carved on the grey stone, whose very uncouthness tells of time gone by when our ancestors worshipped within their walls, give an additional interest to the temples of our forefathers. But, though the new church at Montreal cannot compare with our York Minster, Westminster Abbey, and others of our sacred buildings, it is well worthy the attention of travellers who will meet with nothing to equal it in the Canadas. There are several colleges and nunneries, a hospital for the sick, several Catholic and Protestant churches, meeting houses, a guardhouse with many other public edifices. The riverside portion of town is entirely mercantile. Its narrow, dirty streets and dark houses with heavy iron shutters have a disagreeable appearance, which cannot but make an unfavorable impression on the mind of a British traveler. The other portion of the town, however, is of a different character, and the houses are interspersed with gardens and pleasant walks, which looked very agreeable from the windows of the ballroom of the Nelson Hotel. This room, which is painted from top to bottom, the walls and ceiling, with a coarse imitation of groves and Canadian scenery, commands a superb view of the city, the river, and all the surrounding country, taking in the distant mountains of Chamblay, the shores of St. Lawrence towards La Prairie, and the rapids above and below the island of St. Anne's. The Royal Mountain, Montreal, with its wooded sides, its rich scenery, and its city with its streets and public buildings lie at your feet. With such objects before you, the eye may well be charmed with the scenery of Montreal. We received the greatest attention from the master of the hotel, who is an Italian. The servants of the house are very civil, and the company that we meet at the ordinary very respectable, chiefly emigrants like ourselves, with some lively Frenchmen and women. The table is well supplied, and the charges for board and lodging $1 per day each. I am amused with the variety of characters of which our table is composed. Some of the emigrants appear to entertain the most sanguine hopes of success, appe- appearing to foresee no difficulties in carrying their schemes into effect. As a contrast to these, there is one of my countrymen, just returned from the Western District on his way back to England, who entreats us by no means to go further up this horrid country, as he emphatically styles the upper province, assuring us he would not live in it for all the land it contained. He had been induced by reading Cattermole's pamphlet on the subject of emigration to quit a good farm and gathering together what property he possessed to embark for Canada. Encouraged by the advice of a friend in this country, he purchased a lot of wild land in the Western District. But, sir, said he, addressing my husband with much vehemence, I found I had been vilely deceived. Such land, such a country, I would not live in it for all I could see. Why, there is not a drop of wholesome water to be got, or a potato that is fit to eat. I lived for 2 months in a miserable shed they call a shanty, eaten up alive with mosquitoes. I could get nothing to eat but salted pork, and in short, the discomforts are unbearable. And then all my farming knowledge was quite useless. People know nothing about farming in this country. Why, it would have broken my heart to work among the stumps, and never see such a thing as a well plowed field. And then, he added, in a softer tone, I thought of my poor wife and the little one. I might, for the sake of bettering my condition, have roughed out a year or so myself, but, poor thing, I could not have had the heart to have brought her out from the comforts of England to such a place, not so good as one of our cowhouses or stables, and so I shall just go home. And if I don't tell all my neighbors what sort of a country this is, they are all crazing to throw up their farms and come to. Never trust a word of mine again. It was to no purpose that some persons present argued with him on the folly of returning uh, until he had tried what could be done. He only told them they were fools if they stayed an hour in a country like this, and ended by execrating those persons who deceive the people at home by their false statements, who sum up in a few pages all the advantages without filling a volume with the disadvantages, as they might well do. Persons are apt to deceive themselves as well as to be deceived, said my husband, and having once fixed their minds on any one subject, will only read and believe those things that accord with their wishes. This young man was evidently disappointed in not finding all things as fair and pleasant as at home. He had never reflected on the subject, or he could not have been so foolish as to suppose he would encounter no difficulties in his first outset, in a settlement in the woods. We are prepared to meet with many obstacles and endure many considerable privations, though I dare say we meet with many unforeseen ones, forewarned as we have been by our Canadian friends' letters. Our places are taken in the stage for Lachine, and if all is well, we leave Montreal tomorrow morning. Our trunks, boxes, etc., are to be sent on by the forwarders to Cobourg, August 22nd. Cobourg, August 29th. When I closed my last letter, I told you, my dear mother, that we should leave Montreal by sunrise the following day. But in this we were doomed to be disappointed, and to experience the truth of these words. Boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what an hour may bring forth. Early, early that very morning, just an hour before sunrise, I was seized with the symptoms of the fatal malady that had made so many homes desolate. I was too ill to commence my journey, and with a heavy heart, heard the lumbering wheels rattle over the stones from the door of the hotel. I hourly grew worse, till the sister of the landlady, an excellent young woman who had previously shown me great attention, persuaded me to send for a physician, and my husband, distracted at seeing me in such agony, ran off to seek for the best medical aid. After some little delay, a physician was found. I was then in extreme torture, but was relieved by bleeding, and by the violent fits of sickness that ensued. I will not dwell minutely on my sufferings, suffice to say they were intense. But God, in his mercy, though he chastened and afflicted me, yet gave me not over unto death. From the females of the house I received the greatest kindness. Instead of fleeing, Instead of fleeing affrighted from the chamber of sickness, the two Irish girls almost quarrelled which should be my attendant, while Jane Taylor, the good young woman I before mentioned, never left me from the time I grew so alarmingly ill till a change for the better had come over me, but, at the peril of her own life, supported me in her arms, and held me on her bosom when I was struggling with mortal agony, alternately speaking peace to me, and striving to soothe the anguish of my poor afflicted partner. The remedies applied were bleeding, a portion of opium, blue pill, and some sort of salts, not the common Epsom. The remedies proved effectual, though I suffered much from the sickness and the headache for many hours. The debility and low fever that took place of the cholera obliged me to keep my bed some days. During the two During the two first, my doctor visited me 4 times a day. He was very kind, and on hearing that I was the wife of a British officer emigrating to the Upper Province, he seemed more than ever interested in my recovery, evincing a sympathy for us that was very grateful to our feelings. After a weary confinement of several days, I was at last pronounced in a sufficiently convalescent state to begin my journey, though still so weak that I was scarcely able to support myself. The sun had not yet risen when the stage that was to take us to Lachin, the first 9 miles of our route, drove up to the door, and we gladly bade farewell to a place in which our hours of anxiety had been many, and those of pleasure few. We had, however, experienced a great deal of kindness from those around us, and though perfect strangers, had tasted some of the hospitality for which the city has often been celebrated. I omitted in my former letter telling you how we formed an acquaintance with a respectable merchant in this place, who afforded us a great deal of useful information and introduced us to his wife, a very elegant and accomplished young woman. During our short acquaintance, we passed some pleasant hours at their house, much to our satisfaction. I enjoyed the fresh breeze from the river along the banks of which our road lay. It was a fine sight to see the unclouded sun rising from behind the distant chain of mountains. Below us lay the rapids in their perturbed state, and there was the island of St. Anne's, bringing to our minds Moore's Canadian boat song. We'll sing at St. Anne our parting hymn. The bank of the St. Lawrence, along which our road lay, is higher here than at Montreal, and clothed with brushwood on the summit, occasionally broken with narrow gullies. The soil, as near as I could see, was sandy or light loam. I noticed the wild vine for the first time twining among the saplings. There were raspberry There were raspberry bushes too, and a profusion of that tall yellow flower we call Aaron's goldenrod, a solidago, and the white love everlasting, the same that the chaplets are made of by the French and Swiss girls to adorn the tombs of their friends, and which they call immortelle. The Americans call it life everlasting. Also a tall purple-spiked valerian that I observed growing in the fields among the corn, as plentiful as the bugloss is in our light sandy fields in England. At Lachin, we quitted the stage and went on board a steamer, a fine vessel elegantly fitted up with every accommodation. I enjoyed the passage up the river exceedingly, and should have been delighted with the journey by land, had not my recent illness weakened me so much that I found the rough roads very unpleasant. As to the vehicle, a Canadian stage, it deserves a much higher character than travelers have had the candor to give it, and is so well adapted for the roads over which it passes that I doubt if it could be changed for a more suitable one. This vehicle is calculated to hold 9 persons, 3 back, front, and middle. The middle seat, which swings on broad straps of leather, is by far the easiest. Only you are liable to be disturbed when any of the passengers choose to get out. Certainly, the traveling is arranged with as little trouble to the traveler as possible. Having paid your fare to Prescott, you have no thought or care. When you quit the steamboat, you find a stage ready to receive you and your luggage, which is limited to a certain proportion. When the portage is passed, uh, the land carriage, you shall find a steam vessel ready, where you have every accommodation. The charges are not immoderate, considering the comforts you enjoy. In addition to their own freight, the steamers generally tow up several other vessels. We had 3 Durham boats at one time, besides some other small craft attached to us, which certainly afforded some variety, if not amusement. With the exception of Quebec and Montreal, I must give the preference to the upper province. If not on so grand a scale, the scenery is more calculated to please, from the appearance of industry and fertility it displays. I am delighted in traveling along the road with the neatness, cleanliness, and comfort of the cottages and farms. The log house and shanty rarely occur, having been supplanted by pretty frame houses, built in a superior style, and often painted white lead color or a pale pea green. Around these habitations were orchards, bending down with a rich harvest of apples, plums, and the American crab, those beautiful little scarlet apples so often met with as a wet preserve among our sweetmeats at home. You see none of the signs of poverty or its attendant miseries. No ragged, dirty, squalid children dabbling in mud or dust, but many a tidy, smart-looking lass was spinning at the cottage doors, with bright eyes and braided locks, while the younger girls were seated on the green turf or on the threshold, knitting and singing as blithe as birds. As blithe as birds? As blithe? Blithe. There's something very picturesque in the great spinning wheels that are used in this country for spinning the wool, and if attitude were to be studied among our Canadian lasses, there cannot be one more becoming or calculated to show off the natural advantages of a fine figure than spinning at the big wheel. The spinster does not sit, but walks to and fro, guiding the yarn with one hand, while with the other she turns the wheel. I often notice as we pass by the cottage farms hanks of yarn of different colors hanging on the garden or orchard fence to dry. There were all manner of colors: green, blue, purple, brown, red, and white. A civil landlady, at whose tavern we stopped to change horses, told me these hanks of yarn were first spun and then dyed by the good wives, preparatory to being sent to the loom. She showed me some of this homespun cloth, which really looked very well. It was dulish dark brown, the wool being the produce of a breed of black sheep. This cloth is made up in different ways for family use. Every little dwelling you see, said she, has its lot of land, and consequently its flock of sheep. And as the children are early taught to spin and knit, and help dye the yarn, the parents can afford to see them well and comfortably clothed. Many of these very farms you now see in so thriving a condition were wild land 30 years ago, nothing but Indian hunting grounds. The industry of men, and many of them poor men, that had not that had not a rood of land of their own in their own country, has effected this change. I was much gratified by the reflection to which this good woman's information gave rise. We also are going to purchase wild land, and why may not we see our farm, in process of time, thought I, equal these fertile spots? Surely this is a blessed country to which we have emigrated, said I, pursuing the pleasing idea, where every cottage abounds with the comforts and necessaries of life. I perhaps overlooked at that time the labor, the difficulties, the privations to which these settlers had been exposed when they first came to this country. I saw it only at a distance of many years, under a high state of cultivation, perhaps in the hands of their children or their children's children, while the toil-worn parent's head was low in the dust. Among other objects, my attention was attracted by the appearance of open burying grounds by the roadside. Pretty green mounds, surrounded by groups of walnut and other handsome timber trees, contained the graves of a family, or maybe some favored friends slept quietly below the turf beside them. If the ground was not consecrated, it was hallowed by the tears and prayers of parents and children. These household graves became the more interesting to me on learning that when a farm is disposed of to a stranger, the right of burying their dead is generally stipulated for by the former possessor. You must bear with me if I occasionally weary you with dwelling on trifles. To me, nothing that bears the stamp of novelty is devoid of interest. Even the clay-built ovens, stuck upon four legs at a distance from the houses, were not unnoticed in passing. When there is not the convenience of one of these ovens outside the dwellings, the bread is baked in large iron pots, bake kettles they are termed. I have already seen a loaf as a peck me- as big as a peck measure baking on the hearth in one of these kettles, and tasted of it too. But I think the confined steam rather imparts a peculiar taste to the bread, which you do not perceive in the loaves baked in brick or clay ovens. At first I could not make out what these funny little round buildings perched upon four posts could be, and I took them for beehives till I spied a good woman drying some nice hot loaves out of one that stood on a bit of waste land on the roadside, some 50 yards from the cottage. Besides the ovens, every house had a draw well near it, which differed in the contrivance for raising the water from those I had seen in the old country. The plan is very simple. A long pole, supported by a post, acts as a lever to raise the bucket, and the water can be raised by a child with very trifling exertion. This method is by many persons preferred to either rope or chain, and from its simplicity can be constructed by any person at the mere trouble of fixing the poles. I mention this merely to show the ingenuity of people in this country, and how well adapted all their ways are to their means. Hmm. There is a footnote. It says, this plan is pursued in England and elsewhere, and may be seen in the market gardens on the western suburb of London. It can only be done when the water is near the surface. We were exceedingly gratified by the magnificent appearance of the rapids of the St. Lawrence, at the cascades of which the road commanded a fine view from the elevation of the banks. I should fail in my attempt to describe this grand sheet of turbulent water to you. Hallison has pictured them very minutely in his work on Upper Canada, which I know you are well acquainted with. I regretted that we could not linger to feast our eyes with a scene so wild and grand as the river here appears. But a Canadian stage waits for no one, so we are obliged to content ourselves with a passing sight of these celebrated rapids. We embarked at Couteau du Lac and reached Cornwall late the same evening. Some of the stages travel all night, but I was too much fatigued to commence a journey of 49 miles over Canadian roads that night. Our example was followed by a widow lady and her little family. We had some difficulty in obtaining a lodging, the inns being full of travelers. Here, for the first time, we experienced something of that odious manner ascribed, though doubtless too generally, to the American. Our host seemed perfectly indifferent as to the comfort of his guests, leaving them to wait on themselves or go without what they wanted. The absence of females in these establishments is a great drawback where ladies are traveling. The women keep entirely out of sight, or treat you with that offensive coldness and indifference that you derive little satisfaction from their attendance. After some difficulty in obtaining sight of the landlady of the inn at Cornwall, and asking her to show me a chamber where we might pass the night, with a most ungracious air, she pointed to a door, which opened into a mere closet, in which was a bed divested of curtains, one chair, and an apology for a washstand. Seeing me in some dismay at the sight of this uninviting domicile, she laconically observed there was that or none, unless I chose to sleep in a four-bedded room which had three tenants in it, and those gentlemen. This alternative I somewhat indignantly declined, and in no very good humor retired to my cabin, where vile familiars to the dormitory kept us from closing our weary eyelids till the break of day. We took an early and hasty breakfast, and again commenced our journey. Here our party consisted of myself, my husband, a lady and gentleman with three small children, besides an infant of a month old, all of whom, from the eldest to the youngest, were suffering from whooping cough. Two great Cumberland miners, and a French pilot and his companion. This was a huge, amphibious-looking monster, who bounced in and squeezed himself into a corner seat, giving a knowing nod and comical grin to the driver, who was in the secret, and in utter defiance of all remonstrance at this unlooked-for intrusion, cracked his whip with a flourish that appeared to be reckoned pretty considerably smart by two American travelers that stood on either side of the door at the inn, with their hats not in their hands, nor yet on their heads, but slung by a black ribbon to one of their waistcoat buttons, so as to fall neatly under one arm. This practice I have seen adopted since, and think if Johnny Gilpin had betaken this wise precaution, he might have saved both hat and wig. I was dreadfully fatigued with this day's travelling, being literally bruised black and blue. We suffered much inconvenience from the excessive heat of the day, and could well have dispensed with the company of two out of the four of our bulky companions. We reached Prescott about 5 the same afternoon, where we were met with good treatment at the inn. The female servants were all English, and seemed to vie with each other in attention to us. We saw little in the town of Prescott to interest or please. After an excellent breakfast, we embarked on board the Great Britain, the finest steamer we had yet seen, and here we were joined by our new friends to our great satisfaction. At Brockville we arrived just in time to enjoy what was to me a quite novel sight, a ship launch. A gay and exciting scene it was. The sun shone brilliantly on a concourse of people that thronged the shore in their holiday attire. The church bells rang merrily out, mingling with the music from the deck of the gaily painted vessel that, with flags and streamers and a well-dressed company on board, was preparing for launch. To give additional effect, a salute was fired from a temporary fort erected for the occasion on a little rocky island in front of the town. The schooner took the water in fine style, as if eager to embrace the element which was henceforth to be subject to her. It was a moment of intense interest. The newly launched was greeted with three cheers from the company on board the Great Britain, with a salute from the little fort, and a merry peal from the bells, which were also rung in honor of a pretty bride that came on board with her bridegroom on their way to visit the Falls of Niagara. Brockville is situated just at the entrance of the Lake of the Thousand Islands, and presents a pretty appearance from the water. The town has improved rapidly, I am told, within the last few years, and is becoming a place of some importance. The shores of the St. Lawrence assume a more rocky and picturesque aspect as you advance among its thousand islands, which present every variety of wood and rock. The steamer put in for a supply of firewood at a little village on the American side the river, where also we took on board 25 beautiful horses, which are to be exhibited at Coburg and York for sale. There is nothing at all worthy of observation in the American village, unless I except a novelty that rather amused me. Almost every house had a tiny wooden model of itself, about the bigness of a doll's house, or baby house, I think they are called, stuck up in front of the roof or at the gable end. I was informed by a gentleman on board these baby houses, as I was pleased to call them, were for the swallows to build in. It was midnight when we passed Kingston, so of course I saw nothing of that key to the lakes, as I have heard it styled. When I awoke in the morning, the steamer was dashing gallantly along through the waters of the Ontario, and I experienced a slight sensation of sickness. When the waters of the lake are all agitated, as they sometimes are, by high winds, you might imagine yourself upon a tempest-tossed sea. The shores of the Ontario are very fine, rising in waving lines of hill and dale, clothed with magnificent woods or enlivened by patches of cultivated land and pretty dwellings. At 10 o'clock we reached Coburg. Coburg, at which place we are present, is a neatly built and flourishing village, containing many goods stores, mills, a banking house, and printing office, where a newspaper is published once a week. There's there's a pretty church and a select society, many families of res- and a select society, many families of respectability having fixed their residences in or near the town. Tomorrow we leave Coburg and shall proceed to Peterborough, from which place I shall again write and inform you of our future destination, which will probably be on one of the small links of the autonomy. All right, that was letter 4. Guess it's on to letter 5. All right, letter 5. Journey from Coburg to Amherst. Difficulties to be encountered on first settling in the backwoods. Appearance of the country. Rice Lake. Indian habits. Voyage up the Autonomy. Log house and its inmates. Passage boat. Journey on foot to Peterborough. Peterborough, Newcastle District, September 9th, 1832. We left Coburg on the afternoon of the 1st of September in a light wagon, comfortably lined with buffalo robes. Our fellow travelers consisted of 3 gentlemen and a young lady, all of whom proved very agreeable and willing to afford us every information respecting the country through which we were traveling. The afternoon was fine, one of those rich, mellow days we often experience in the early part of September. The warm hues of autumn were already visible on the forest trees, but rather spoke of ripeness than decay. The country around Coburg is well cultivated, a great portion of the woods having been superseded by open fields, pleasant farms, and fine flourishing orchards, with green pastures where abundance of cattle were grazing. The county jail and courthouse at Amherst, about a mile and a half from Coburg, is a fine stone edifice situated on a rising ground which commands an extensive view over the Lake Ontario and surrounding scenery. As you advance further up the country, in the direction of the Hamilton or Rice Lake Plains, the land rises into bold sweeping hills and dales. The outline of the country reminded me of the hilly part of Gloucestershire, or is it just Gloucester? You want, however, the charm with which civilization has so eminently adorned that fine county, with all its romantic villages, flourishing towns, cultivated farms, and extensive downs, so thickly covered with flocks and herds. Here the bold forests of oak, beech, maple, and basswood, or is it basswood? With now and then a grove of dark pine, cover the hills, only enlivened by an occasional settlement, with its log house and zigzag fences of split timber. These fences are very offensive to my eye. I look in vain for the rich hedgerows of my native country. Even the stone fences in the north and west of England, cold and bare as they are less unsightly. The settlers, however, invariably adopt whatever plan saves time, labor, and money. The great law of expediency is strictly observed. It is born of necessity. Matters of taste appear to be little regarded, or are, at all events, after considerations. I could see a smile hover on the lips of my fellow travelers on hearing of our projected plans for the adornment of our future dwelling. If you go into the backwoods, your house must necessarily be a log house, said an elderly gentleman, who had been a settler many years in the country, for you will most probably be out of the way of a sawmill, and you will find so much to do and so many obstacles to encounter for the first 2 or 3 years that you will hardly have the opportunity for carrying these improvements into effect. There is an old saying, he added, with a mixture of gravity and good humor in his looks. that I used to hear when I was a boy. First, first, first creep and then go. Creep is in infants crawling on all fours, apparently. Matters are not carried on quite so easily here as at home, and the truth of this a very few weeks' acquaintance with the bush, as we term all unbroken forest land, will prove. At the end of 5 years, you may begin to talk of these pretty improvements and elegancies, and you will then be able to see what a little you are about, and you will then be able to see a little what you are about. I thought, said I, everything in this country was done with so much expedition. I'm sure I have heard and read of houses being built in a day. The old gentleman laughed. Yes, yes, he replied. Travelers find no difficulty in putting up a house in 12 or 24 hours, and so the log walls can be raised in that time or even less. But the house is not completed when the outer walls are up, as your husband will find to his cost. But all the works on emigration I have read, replied I, give a fair and flattering picture of a settler's life, for, according to their statements, the difficulties are easily removed. Never mind books, said my companion. Use your own reason. Look on those interminable forests, through which the eye can only penetrate a few yards, and tell me how those vast timbers are to be removed, utterly extirpated, I may say, from the face of the earth, the ground cleaned and burnt, a crop sown and fenced, and a house to shelter you raised, without difficulty, without expense, without great labor. Never tell me of what is said in books, written, very frequently, by tarry-at-home travelers. Give me facts. One honest, candid emigrant's experience is worth all that has been written on the subject. Besides, that which may be a true picture of one part of the country will hardly suit another. The advantages and disadvantages arising from soil, situation, and progress of civilization are very different in different districts. Even the prices of goods and of produce, stock and labor, vary exceedingly, according as you are near to or distant from towns and markets. I began to think my fellow traveler spoke sensibly on the subject, with which the experience of 13 years had made him perfectly conversant. I began to apprehend that we also had taken too flattering a view of a settler's life as it must be in the backwoods. Time and our own personal knowledge will be the surest test, and to that we must bow, or bow. I guess cave in and bend, bow. We are ever prone to believe that which we are ever prone to believe that which we wish. About halfway between Coburg and the Rice Lake, there is a pretty valley between two steep hills. Here there is a good deal of cleared land in the tavern. The place is called the Cold Springs. Who knows, but some century or two hence the spot may become, or who knows, but some century or two hence this spot may become a fashionable place of resort to drink the waters. A Canadian Bath or Cheltenham may spring up where now nature revels in her wilderness of forest trees. We now ascended the plains, a fine elevation of land for many miles, scantily clothed with oaks and here and there bushy pines, with other trees and shrubs. The soil is in some places sandy, but varies, I am told, considerably in different parts, and is covered in large tracts with rich herbage, affording abundance of the finest pasture for cattle. A number of exquisite flowers and shrubs adorn these plains, which rival any garden in beauty during the spring and summer months. Many of these plants are peculiar to the plains, and are rarely met with in any other situation. The trees, too, though inferior in size to those in the forests, are more picturesque, growing in groups or singly, at considerable intervals, giving a sort of park-like appearance to this portion of the country. The prevailing opinion seems to be that the plains laid out in grazing or dairy farms would answer the purpose of settlers well, as there is plenty of land that will grow wheat and other corn crops, and can be improved at a small expense, besides abundance of natural pasture for cattle. One great advantage seems to be that the plow can be introduced directly, and the labor of preparing the ground is necessarily much less than where it is wholly covered with wood. There are several settlers on these plains possessing considerable farms. The situation, I should think, must be healthy and agreeable from the elevation and dryness of the land, and the pleasant prospect they command of the country below them, especially where the Rice Lake, with its various islands and picturesque shores, is visible. The ground itself is pleasingly broken into hill and valley, sometimes gently sloping, at other times abrupt and almost precipitous. Hmm. An American farmer, who formed one of our party at breakfast the following morning, told me that these plains were formerly famous hunting grounds of the Indians, who, to prevent the growth of the timbers, burned them year after year. This, in process of time, destroyed the young trees, so as to prevent them again from accumulating to the extent they formerly did. Sufficient only was left to form coverts, for the deer resort hither in great herds for the sake of a peculiar tall sort of grass with which these plains abound, called deer grass, on which they became exceedingly fat at certain seasons of the year. Even, even enclosed in before we reached the tavern on the shores of the Rice Lake, where we were to pass the night, so that I lost something of the beautiful scenery which this fine expanse of water presents as you descend the plains toward its shores. The glimpses I caught of it were by the faint but frequent flashes of lightning that illuminated the horizon to the north, which just revealed enough to make me regret I could I could see no more that night. The Rice Lake is prettily diversified with small wooded islets. The north bank rises gently from the water's edge. Within sight of Sully, the tavern from which the steamboat starts that goes up the Otonabee, you see several well-cultivated settlements, and beyond the Indian village, the missionaries have a school for the education and instruction of the Indian children. Many of them can both read and write fluently, and are greatly improved in their moral and religious conduct. They are well and comfortably clothed, and have houses to live in, but they are still too much attached to their wandering habits to become good and industrious settlers. During certain seasons, they leave the village and encamp themselves in the woods along the borders of the lakes and rivers that present the most advantageous hunting and fishing grounds. The Rice Lake and Mud Lake, the Rice Lake and Mud Lake Indians belong, I am told, to the Chippewas, but the traits of cunning and warlike ferocity that formerly marked this singular people seem to have disappeared beneath the milder influence of Christianity. Certain it is that the introduction of the Christian religion is the first greatest step towards civilization and improvement, its very tendency being to break down the strongholds of prejudice and ignorance, and unite mankind in one bond of social brotherhood. I have been told that for some time drunkenness was unknown, and even the moderate use of spirits was religiously abstained from by all the converts. This abstinence is still practiced by some families, but of late the love of ardent spirits has again crept in among them, bringing discredit upon their faith. It is indeed hardly to be wondered at when the Indian sees those around him that call themselves Christians, and who are better educated and enjoy the advantages of civilized society, indulging to excess in this degrading vice, that he should suffer his natural inclination to overcome his Christian duty, which might in some have taken no deep root. I have been surprised and disgusted by the censures passed on the erring Indian by persons who were foremost in indulgence at the table and the tavern, as if the crime of drunkenness were more excusable in the man of education than in the half-reclaimed savage. There are some fine settlements on the Rice Lake, but I am told the shores are not considerably healthy, the inhabitants being subject to lake fevers and ague, especially where the ground is low and swampy. These fevers and agues are supposed by some people to originate in the extensive rice beds, which cause a stagnation in the water. The constant evaporation from the surface acting on a mass of decaying vegetation must tend to have a bad effect on the constitution of those that are immediately exposed to its pernicious influence. Besides numerous small streams, here called creeks, two considerable rivers, the Otonabee and the Trent find an outlet for the waters in the Rice Lake. These rivers are connected by a chain of small lakes, which you may trace on any good map of the province. I send you a diagram which has been published at Coburg, which will give you the geography of this portion of the country. It is on one of these small lakes we purpose purchasing land, which, should the navigation of these waters be carried into effect, as is generally supposed to be in contemplation, will render the lands on their shores very advantageous to the settlers. At present, they are interrupted by large blocks of granite and limestone, rapids, and falls, which prevent any but canoes or flat-bottomed boats from passing on them, and even these are limited to certain parts, on account of the above-named obstacles. By deepening the bed of the river and lakes, and forming locks in some parts and canals, the whole sweep of these waters might be thrown open to of Quint, the Bay of Quint, or Quint. Yeah, I guess it's Quint. The expense, however, would necessarily be great. Until the townships of this portion of the district be fully settled, it is hardly to be expected that so vast an undertaking should be effected, however desirable it may be. We left the tavern at Rice Lake after an unusual delay at 9 o'clock. The morning was damp, and a cold wind blew over the lake, which appeared to little advantage through the drizzling rain, from which I was glad to shroud my face and my warm plaid cloak, for there was no cabin or other shelter in the little steamer than an inefficient awning. Oops, that was an alarm. Sorry about that. Right. This apology for a steamboat formed a considerable contrast with the superbly appointed vessels we had lately been passengers on the Ontario and the St. Lawrence. But the circumstance of a steamer at all on the Otonabee was a matter of surprise to us, and of exultation to the first settlers along its shores, who for many years had been contented with no better mode of transport than a scow or a canoe for themselves and their marketable produce, or through the worst possible roads with a wagon or sleigh. The Otonabee is a fine, broad, clear stream, divided into two mouths at its entrance to the Rice Lake by a low tongue of land, too swampy to be put under cultivation. This beautiful river, for such I consider it to be, winds its way between thickly wooded banks, which rise gradually as you advance higher up the country. Towards noon, the mist cleared off, and the sun came forth in all the brilliant beauty of a September day. So completely we were sheltered, so completely were we sheltered from the wind by the thick wall of pines on either side, that I no longer felt the least inconvenience from the cold that had chilled me on crossing the lake in the morning. To the mere passing traveler who cares little for the minute beauties of scenery, there is certainly a monotony in the long and unbroken line of woods which insensibly inspires a feeling of gloom almost touching on sadness. Still, there are objects to charm and delight the close observer of nature. His eye will be attracted by fantastic bowers, which are formed by the scarlet creeper or Canadian ivy, and the wild vine, flinging their closely entwined wreaths of richly tinted foliage from bough to bough of the forest trees, mingling their hues with the splendid rose-tipped branches of the soft maple, the autumnal tints of which are unrivaled in beauty by any of our forest trees at home. The purple clusters of the grape, by no means so contemptible in size as I had been led to imagine, looked temptingly to my longing eyes as they appeared just ripening among these forest bowers. I am told the juice forms delicious and highly flavored jelly, boiled with sufficient quantity of sugar. Uh, Flavored jelly, boiled with sufficient quantity of sugar. The seeds are too large to make any other preparation of them practicable. I shall endeavor, at some time or other, to try the improvement that can be effected by cultivation. One is apt to imagine where nature has so abundantly bestowed fruits, that is the most favorable climate for their attaining perfection with the assistance of culture and soil. The waters of the Otonabee are so clear and free from impurity that you distinctly see every stone pebble, or shell at its bottom. Here and there, an opening in the forest reveals some tributary stream, working its way beneath the gigantic trees that meet above it. The silence of the scene is unbroken, but by the sudden rush of the wild duck, disturbed from his retreat among the shrubby willows, that in some parts fringe the left bank, or the shrill cry of the kingfisher as it darts across the river. The steamboat The steamboat put in for a supply of firewood at a clearing about halfway from Peterborough, and I gladly availed myself of the opportunity of indulging my inclination for gathering some of the splendid cardinal flowers that grew among the stones by the river's brink. Here, too, I plucked as sweet a rose as ever graced an English garden. I also found among the grass of the meadowland spearmint, and, near to the bank, peppermint. There was a bush resembling our hawthorn, which on examination proved to be the cockspur hawthorn, with fruit as large as cherries, pulpy, and of a pleasant tartness, not much unlike to tamarinds. The thorns of this tree were of formidable length and strength. I should think it might be introduced with great advantage to form live fences. The fruit, too, would prove by no means contemptible as a preserve. As I felt a great curiosity to see the interior of a log house, I entered the open doorway of the tavern, as the people termed it, under the pretext of buying a draught of milk. The interior of this rude dwelling presented no very inviting aspect. The walls were of rough, unhewn logs, filled between the chinks with moss and irregular wedges of wood to keep out the wind and rain. The unplastered roof displayed the rafters, covered with moss and lichens, green, yellow, and gray, above which might be seen the shingles, dyed to a fine mahogany red by the smoke which refused to ascend the wide clay and stone chimney, to curl gracefully about the roof, and seek its exit in the various crannies and apertures with which the roof and the sides of the building abounded. The floor was of earth, which had become pretty hard and smooth through use. This hut reminded me of the one described by the four Russian sailors that were left to winter on the island of Spitzbergen. Its furniture was of corresponding rudeness: a few stools, rough and unplaned, a a deal table, which, from being manufactured from unseasoned wood, was divided by three wide open seams, and was only held together by its ill-shaped legs. Two or three blocks of gray granite, placed beside the hearth, served for seats for the children, with the addition of two beds, raised a little above the ground by a frame of split cedars. On these lowly couches lay extended two poor men, suffering under the wasting effects of lake fever, their their yellow bilious faces strangely contrasted with the gay patchwork quilts that covered them. I felt much concern for the poor emigrants, who told me they had not been many weeks in the country when they were seized with the fever and ague. They both had wives and small children, who seemed very miserable. The wives also had been sick with ague, and had not a house or even shanty of their own up. The husbands, having fallen ill, were unable to do anything, and much of the little money they had brought out with them had been expended in board and lodging in this miserable place, which they dignified by the name of a tavern. I cannot say I was greatly prepossessed in favor of their hostess, a harsh, covetous woman. Besides the various emigrants, men, women, and children, that lodged within the walls, the log house had tenants of another description. A fine calf occupied a pen in a corner. Some pigs roamed grunting about in company with some half-dozen fowls. The most attractive objects were three snow-white pigeons that were meekly picking up crumbs and looking as if they were too pure and innocent to be inhabitants of such a place. Owing to the shallowness of the river at this season and to the rapids, the steamboat is unable to go up the whole way to Peterborough, and a scow or rowboat, as it is sometimes termed, a huge unwieldy flat-bottomed machine, meets the passengers at a certain part of the river with, within sight of a singular pine tree on the right bank. This is termed the Yankee Bonnet. from the fancied resemblance of the topmost bows to a sort of cap worn by the Yankees, not much unlike the blue bonnet of Scotland. Unfortunately, the steamer ran aground some 4 miles below the usual place of rendezvous, and we waited till near 4 o'clock for the scow. When it made its appearance, we found to our discomfort the rowers, 8 in number and all Irishmen, were under the exciting influence of a keg of whiskey, which they had drunk dry on the voyage. They were moreover exasperated by the delay on the part of the steamer, which gave them 4 miles additional heavy rowing. Beside a number of passengers, there was an enormous load of furniture, trunks, boxes, chests, sacks of wheat, barrels of flour, salt, and pork, with many miscellaneous packages and articles, small and great, which were piled to a height I thought very unsafe, both to goods and passengers. With a marvelous ill grace, the men took up their oars when their load was completed, but declared they would go on shore and make a fire and cook their dinners, they having not eaten any food, though they had taken large potations of the whiskey. This measure was opposed by some of the gentlemen, and a fierce and angry scene ensued, which ended in the mutineers flinging down their oars and positively refusing to row another stroke till they had satisfied their hunger. Perhaps I had a fellow feeling for them, as I began to be exceedingly hungry, almost ravenous, myself having fasted since 6 that morning. Indeed, so faint was I, that I was fain to get my husband to procure me a morsel of the coarse, uninviting bread that was produced by the rowers, and which they ate with huge slices of raw pickled pork, seasoning this unseemly meal with curses, not loud but deep, and bitter taunts against those who prevented them from cooking their food like Christians. While I was eagerly eating the bit of bread, an old farmer, who had eyed me for some time with a mixture of curiosity and compassion, said, "Poor thing! Well, you do seem hungry indeed, and I dare say are just out from the old country, and so little used to such hard fare. Here are some cakes that my woman, idest wife, put in my pocket when I left home. I care nothing for them, but they are better than that bad bread. Take 'em and welcome." With these words, he tossed some very respectable homemade seed cakes into my lap, and truly never was anything more welcome than this seasonable refreshment. A sullen and gloomy spirit seemed to prevail among our boatmen, which by no means diminished as the evening drew on, and the rapids were near. The sun had set, and the moon and stars rose brilliantly over the still waters, which gave back the reflection of this glorious multitude of heavenly bodies. A sight so passing fair, a sight so pass, mm, a sight so passing fair might have stilled the most turbulent spirits into peace. At least so I thought, as, wrapped in my cloak, I leant back against the supporting arm of my husband, and looking from the waters to the sky, and from the sky to the waters, with delight and admiration. My pleasant reverie was, however, soon ended, when I suddenly felt the boat touch the rocky bank, and heard the boatmen protesting they would go no further that night. We went nearly 3 miles below Peterborough, and how I was to walk this distance, weakened as I was by recent illness and fatigue of our long travelling, I knew not. To spend the night in an open boat exposed to the heavy dews arising from the river would be almost death. While we were deliberating on what to do, the rest of the passengers had made up their minds and taken the way to the woods by a road they were well acquainted with. They were soon out of sight, all but one gentleman, who was bargaining with one of the rowers to take him and his dog across the river at the head of the wrappers in a skiff. Imagine our situation at 10 o'clock at night, without knowing a single step of our road, put on shore to find the way to the distant town as we best could, or pass that night in the dark forest. Almost in despair, we entreated the gentleman to be our guide as far as he went, but so many obstacles beset our path in the form of newly chopped trees and blocks of stone scattered along the shore that it was with utmost difficulty we could keep him in sight. At last we came up at last we came up with him at the place appointed to meet the skiff, and with a pertinacy that at another time and in other circumstances we should never have adopted, we all but insisted on being admitted into the boat. An angry growl an angry growling consent was extorted from the surly Charon, and we hastily entered the frail bark, which seemed hardly calculated to convey us in safety to the opposite shores. I could not help indulging in the feeling of indescribable fear as I listened to the torrent of profane invective that burst forth continually from the lips of the boatman. Once or twice we were in danger of being overset by the boughs of the pines and cedars which had fallen into the water near the banks. Right glad was I when we reached the opposite shores, but here a new trouble arose. There was yet more untracked wood to cross before we again met the skiff, which had to pass up a small rapid and meet us at the head of the small lake, an expansion of the Otonabee a little below Peterborough. At the distance of every few yards, our path was obstructed by fallen trees, mostly hemlock, spruce, or cedar, the branches of which are so thickly interwoven that it is scarcely possible to separate them, or force a passage through the tangled thicket which they form. Had it not been for the humane assistance of our conductor, I know not how I should have surmounted these difficulties. Sometimes I was ready to sink down from very weariness. At length I hailed, with a joy I could hardly have supposed possible, the gruff voice of the Irish rower, and after considerable grumbling on his part, we were again seated. Glad enough we were to see, by the blazing light of an enormous log heap, the house of our friend. Here we received the offer of a guide to show us the way to town by a road cut through the wood. We partook of the welcome refreshment of tea, and having gained a little strength by a short rest, we once more commenced our journey, guided by a ragged but polite Irish boy, whose frankness and good humor quite won our regards. He informed us he was one of 7 orphans who had lost father and mother in the cholera. It was a sad thing, he said, to be left fatherless and motherless in a strange land, and he swept away the tears that gathered in his eyes as he told a simple but sad tale of his early bereavement, but added cheerfully he had met with a kind master who had taken some of his brothers and sisters into his service as well as himself. Just as we were emerging from the gloom of the wood, we found our progress impeded by a creek, as the boy called it, over which he told us we must pass by a log bridge before we could get into town, before we could get to the town. Now the lo- Now the log bridge was composed of one log, or rather a fallen tree, thrown across the stream, rendered very slippery by the heavy dew that had risen from the swamp. As the log admitted of only one person at a time, I could receive no assistance from my companions, and though our little guide, with a natural politeness arising from the benevolence of his disposition, did me all the service in his power by holding the lantern close to the surface to show all the light he could on the subject, I had the ill luck to fall in up to my knees in the water, my head turning quite giddy, just as I came to the last step or two. Thus I was wet thus I was wet as well as weary. To add to our misfortune, we saw the lights disappear one by one in the village, till a solitary candle, glimmering from the upper chambers of 1 or 2 houses, were our only beacons. We had yet a lodging to seek, and it was near midnight before we reached the door of the principal inn. There, at least, thought I, our troubles for tonight will end. But great was our mortification on being told there was not a spare bed to be had in the house, even every one being occupied by emigrants going up to one of the back townships. I could go no further, and we petitioned for a place by the kitchen fire, where we might rest at least, if not sleep, and I might dry my wet garments on and I might dry my wet garments. On seeing my condition, the landlady took compassion on me, led me to a blazing fire, which, which her damsels quickly roused up. One, one brought a warm bath for my feet, while another provided a warm potation, which I really believe strange and unusual to my lips as it was, did me good. In short, we received every kindness and attention that we required from from mine host and hostess, who relinquished their own bed for our accommodations, contenting themselves with a shake down before the fire. I can now smile at the disasters of that day, but at the time they appeared no trifles, as you may well suppose. Farewell, my dearest mother. Oh, okay. That was letter 5. Um, let's see. Okay, I think I can go one more. Letter 6. Peterborough. Manners and language of the Americans. Scotch engineman. Description of Peterborough and its environs. Canadian flowers. Shanties. Hardships suffered by first settlers. Process of establishing a farm. Peterborough, September 11th, 1832. It is now settled that we abide here till after the government sale has taken place. We are, then, to remain with S and his family till we have gotten a few acres chopped, and a log house put up our own land, having determined to go at once into the bush on account of our military grant, which we have been so fortunate as to draw in the neighborhood of S. We have fully made up our minds to enter at once and cheerfully on the privations and inconveniences attending such a situation, as there is no choice between relinquishing that great advantage and doing our settlement duties. We shall not be worse off than others who have gone before us to the unsettled townships, many of whom, naval and military officers, with their families, have had to struggle with considerable difficulties, but who are now beginning to feel the advantages arising from their exertions. In addition to the land he is entitled in addition to the land he is entitled to as an officer in the British service, my husband is in treaty for the purchase of an eligible lot by small lakes. This will give us a water frontage and a further inducement to bring us within a little distance of us, so that we shall not be quite so lonely as if we had gone on to our government lot at once. We have experienced some attention and hospitality from several of the residents of Peterborough. There is a very genteel society, chiefly composed of officers and their families, besides the professional men and storekeepers. Many of the latter are persons of respectable family and good education. Though a store is, in fact, nothing better than what we should call in the country towns at home a general shop, yet the storekeeper in Canada holds a very different rank from the shopkeeper of the English village. The storekeepers are the merchants and bankers of the places in which they reside. Almost all money matters are transacted by them, and they are often men of landed property in consequence, not unfrequently filling the situations of magistrates, commissioners, and even members of the provincial parliament. As they maintain a rank in society which entitles them to equality with the aristocracy of the country, you must not be surprised when I tell you that it is no uncommon circumstance to see the sons of naval and military officers and clergymen standing behind a counter or wielding an axe in the woods with their father's choppers. Nor do they lose their grade in society by such employment. After all, it is education and manners that must distinguish the gentleman in this country, seeing that the laboring man, if he is diligent and industrious, may soon become his equal in point of worldly possessions. The ignorant man, let him be ever so wealthy, can never be equal to the man of education. It is the mind that forms the distinction between the classes in this country. Knowledge is power. We had heard so much of the odious manners of the Yankees in this country that I was rather agreeably surprised by the few specimens of native Americans that I had seen. They were, for the most part, polite, well-behaved people. The only peculiarities I observed in them were a certain nasal twang in speaking, and in some few odd phrases, but in speaking, and some few odd phrases. But these were only used by the lower class, who guess and calculate a little more than we do. Mm, One of one of their most remarkable terms is to fix. Whatever work requires to be done, it must be fixed. Fix the room is to set it in order. Fix the table, fix the fire, says the mistress to her servants, and the things are fixed accordingly. I was amused one day by hearing a woman tell her husband the chimney wanted fixing. I thought it seemed secure enough, and was a little surprised when the man got a rope and cedar a few cedar boughs, with which he dislodged an accumulation of soot that caused the fire to smoke. The chimney being fixed, all went right again. This odd term is not confined to the lower orders alone, and from hearing it so often, it becomes a standard word even among the later emigrants from our own country. With the exception of some remarkable expressions and an attempt at introducing fine words in their everyday conversation, the lower order of Yankees have a decided advantage over our English peasantry in the use of grammatical language. They speak better English than you'll hear from persons of the same class in any part of England, Ireland, or Scotland, a fact that we should be unwilling, I suppose, to allow at home. If I were asked what appeared to me the most striking feature in the manners of the Americans that I had met with, I should say it was the coldness it was it was coldness approaching to apathy. I do not at all imagine them to be deficient in feeling or real sensibility, but they do not suffer their emotion to be seen. They are less profuse in their expressions of welcome and kindness than we are, though probably quite as sincere. No one doubts their hospitality, but after all, one likes to see the hearty shake of the hand and to hear the cordial word that makes one feel oneself welcome. Persons who come to this Persons who come to this country are very apt to confound the old settlers from Britain with the native Americans. And when they meet with the people and when they meet probably Native Americans likely refers to earlier immigrants and not to I guess the Indians in this case. Anyway, persons who come to this country are very apt to confound the old settlers from Britain with the Native Americans, and when they meet with people of rude, offensive manners, using certain Yankee words in their conversation, and making a display of independence not exactly suitable to their own aristocratical notions, they immediately suppose they must be genuine Yankees, while they are, in fact, only imitators. And you well know the fact that a bad imitation is always worse than the original. You would be surprised to see how soon the newcomers fall into this disagreeable manner and affectation of equality, especially in the interior class of Irish and Scotch, the English less so. We were rather entertained by the behavior of a young Scotchman, the engineer of a steamer, on my husband addressing him with reference to the management of the engine. His manners were surely and almost insolent. He scrupulously avoided the least approach to courtesy or outward respect. Nay, he even went so far as to seat himself on the bench close beside me, and observe that, among the many advantages this country offered to settlers like him, he did not reckon it the least of them that he was not obliged to take off his hat when he spoke to people, meaning persons of our degree, or address them by any other title than their name. Besides, besides, he could go and take a seat beside any gentleman or lady either, and think himself to the full as good as them. Very likely, I replied, hardly able to refrain from laughing at this sally. But I doubt you greatly overrate the advantage of such privileges, for you cannot oblige the lady or gentleman to entertain the same opinion of your qualifications, or to remain seated beside you, unless it pleases them to do so. With these words, I rose up and left the independent gentleman, evidently a little confounded at the maneuver. However, he soon recovered his self-possession and continued swinging the axe he held in his hand, and said, "It is no crime, I guess, being born a poor man." "None in the world," replied my husband. "A man's birth is not his own choosing. A man can no more help being born poor than rich. Neither is it the fault of a gentleman being born of parents who occupy a higher station in society than his neighbor. I hope you will allow this." The Scotchman was obliged to yield a reluctant affirmative to the latter position, but concluded with again repeating his satisfaction at not being obliged in this country to take off his hat or speak with respect, gentlemen, as they style themselves. No one, my friend, could have obliged you to be well mannered at home any more than in Canada. Surely you could have kept your hat on your head if you had been so disposed. If you had been so disposed, no gentleman would have knocked it off, I am sure. As to the boasted advantage of rude manners in Canada, I should think something of it if it benefited you the least, or put one extra dollar in your pocket. But I have my doubts if it has that profitable effect. There is a comfort, I guess, in considering oneself equal to a gentleman, particularly if you could induce the gentleman to think the same. This was a point that seemed rather to disconcert our candidate for equality, who commenced whistling and kicking his heels with redoubled energy. Now, said his tormentor, you have explained your notions of Canadian independence. Be so good as to explain the machinery of your engine, with which you seem very well acquainted. The man eyed my husband for a minute, half sulking, half pleased at the implied compliment on his skill, and, walking off to the engine, discussed the management of it with considerable fluency, and from that time treated us with perfect respect. He was evidently struck with my husband's reply to his question, put in a most discourteous tone. Pray, what makes a gentleman? I shall think you to answer me that. Uh, I'll thank you to answer me that. Good manners and education, was the reply. A rich man or high-born man, if he is rude, or if he is rude, ill-mannered, and ignorant, is no more a gentleman than yourself. This put the matter on a different footing, and the engineer had the good sense to perceive that rude familiarity did not constitute a gentleman. But it is now time I should give you some account of Peterborough, which, in point of situation, is superior to any place I have yet seen in the upper province. It occupies a central point between the townships of Monaghan, Smith, Cavan, Otonabee, and Douro. Douro? Something like that. And may with propriety be considered as the capital of the Newcastle district. It is situated on a fine elevated plain just above the small lake, where the river is divided by two wooded islets. The original or government part of the town is laid out in half-acre lots, the streets of which are now fast filling up, are nearly at right angles with the river, and extend towards the plains to the northeast. These plains form a beautiful natural park, finely diversified with hill and dale, covered with a lovely green sward, enameled with a variety of the most exquisite flowers, and planted, as if by nature's own hand, with groups of feathery pines, oaks, balsam, poplar, and silver birch. The views from these plains are delightful. Whichever way you turn your eyes, they are gratified by a diversity of hill and dale, wood and water, with the town spreading over a considerable tract of ground. The plains descend with a steep declivity towards the river, which rushes with considerable impetu- impetuosity, impetuous, impetuosity between its banks. Fancy a long, narrow valley and separating the east and west portions of the town into two distinct villages. The Autonomy Bank rises to a loftier elevation than the Monaghan side, and commands an extensive view over the intervening valley, the opposite town, and the boundary forest and the hills behind it. It is called Peterborough East, and is in the hands of two or three individuals of large capital, from whom the town lots are purchased. Peterborough thus divided covers a great extent of ground, more than sufficient for the formation of a large city. The the number of inhabitants are now reckoned at several hundred and upwards, and if it continues to increase as rapidly in the next few years as it has done lately, it will soon be a very populous town. There is a great water power, both as regards the river and the fine broad creek, which winds its way through the town and falls into the lake below. There are several saw and grist mills, a distillery, fulfilling mill, not fulfilling mill, a fulling mill, two principal inns, besides smaller ones, a small number of good stores, a government schoolhouse, which also serves for a church, till one more suitable should be built. The plains are sold off in park lots, and some pretty little dwellings are being built, but I much fear the natural beauties of this lovely spot will soon be spoiled. I am never weary with the strolling about, climbing the hills and I am never weary with strolling about, climbing the hills in every direction, to catch some new prospect, or gather some new flowers, which, though getting late in the summer, are still abundant. Among the plants with whose names I am acquainted are a variety of shrubby asters of every tint of blue, purple, and pearly white, a lilac monarda, most delightfully aromatic, even to the dry stalks and seed vessels, the white Nephalium, or everlasting flower, roses of several kinds, a few late buds of which I found in the valley near the church. I also noticed among the shrubs a very pretty little plant, resembling our box. It trails along the ground, sending up branches and shoots. The leaves the leaves turn of a deep copper red. Yet, in spite of this contradiction, it is an evergreen. I also noticed some beautiful lichens, with coral caps surmounting the gray hollow footstalks, which grow in irregular tufts among the dry mosses, or more frequently I found them covering the roots of the trees or half-decayed timbers. Among a variety of fungi, I gathered a hollow cup of the most splendid scarlet within, and a pale fawn color, without. And another very beautiful fungi consisted of small branches like clusters of white coral, but of so delicate a texture that the slightest touch caused them to break. The ground in many places was covered with a thick carpet of strawberries of many varieties, which afford a constant dessert during the season to those who choose to pick them, a privilege of which I am sure I should gladly avail myself were I near them in the summer. Beside the plants I have myself observed in blossom, I am told the spring and summer. Beside the plants I have myself observed in blossom, I am told the spring and summer produce many others: the orange lily, the phlox or purple lichnidea, the moccasin flower, or lady slipper, lilies of the valley in abundance, and towards the banks of the creek and the Otonabee, the splendid cardinal flower, Lobelia cardinalis, waves its scarlet spikes of blossom. I am inclined to be angry when I admire the beauty of the Canadian flowers, to be constantly reminded that they are scentless, and therefore scarcely worthy of attention, as if the eye could not be charmed by beauty of form and harmony of colors, independent of the sense of smelling being gratified. To redeem this country from the censure cast on it by a very clever gentleman I once met in London, who said, "The flowers were without perfume, and the birds without song," I have already discovered several highly aromatic plants and flowers. The milkweed must not be omitted among these, a beautiful shrubby plant with purple flowers, which are alike remarkable for beauty of color and richness of scent. I shall very soon begin to collect a hortus siccus for Eliza, with a description of the plant's growth and qualities. Any striking particulars respecting them I shall make notes of, and tell her she may depend on my sending my specimens, with seeds of such I can collect, at some fitting opportunity. I consider this country um, opens a wide and fruitful field to the inquiries of the botanist. I now deeply regret I did not benefit by the frequent offers Eliza made me of prosecuting a study which I once thought dry, but now regard as highly interesting, and a fertile source of mental enjoyment, especially to those who, living in the bush, must necessarily be shut out from the pleasures of a large circle of friends and the varieties that a town or village offer. On Sunday I went to church, the first opportunity I had of attending public worship since I was in the Highlands of Scotland, and surely I had reason and surely I had reason to bow my knees in thankfulness to that merciful God who had brought us through the perils of the great deep and the horrors of the pestilence. Never did our beautiful liturgy seem so touching and impressive as it did that day, offered up in our lowly log-built church in the wilderness. This simple edifice is situated at the foot of a gentle slope on the plains, surrounded by groups of oaks and feathery pines, which, though inferior in point of size to the huge pines and oaks of the forest, are far more agreeable to the eye, branching out in a variety of fantastic forms. The turf here is of an emerald greenness. In short, it is a sweet spot, retired from the noise and bustle of the town, a fitting place in which to worship God in spirit and in truth. There are many beautiful walks towards the Smithtown Hills, and along the banks that overlook the river. The summit of this ridge is sterile, and is thickly set with loose blocks of red and gray granite, interspersed with large masses of limestone, scattered in every direction. They are mostly smooth and rounded, as if by the action of water. As they are detached and merely occupy the surface of the ground, it seems strange to me how they came at that elevation. A geologist would doubtless be able to solve the mystery in a few minutes. The oaks that grow on this high bank are rather larger and more flourishing than those in the valleys and more fertile portions of the soil. Behind the town, in the direction of the Cavan and Emily roads, is a wide space which I call the squatter's ground, it being entirely covered with shanties in which the poor emigrants, commuted pensioners, pensioners, and the like, have located themselves in families. Some remain here under the ostensible reason of providing a shelter for their wives and children till they have prepared a home for their reception on their respective grants. But not unfrequently it happens that they are too indolent or really unable to work on their lots, often situated many miles in the backwoods and in distant and unsettled townships, presenting great obstacles to the poor emigrant, which it requires more energy and courage to encounter than is possessed by a vast number of them. Others, of idle and profligate habits, spend the money they received and sell the land for which they gave away their pensions, after which they remain miserable squatters on the shanty ground. The shanty is sort of a primitive hut in Canadian architecture, and is nothing more than a shed built of logs, the chinks between the rounded edges of the timbers being filled with mud, moss, and bits of wood. The roof is frequently composed of logs, split and hollowed with the axe, and placed side by side so that the edges rest on each other, the concave and convex surfaces being alternately uppermost. Every other log forms a channel to carry off the rain and melting snow. The eaves of this building resemble the scalloped edges of a clamshell. Scalloped edges of a clamshell, I guess, maybe. But rude as this covering is, it effectually answers the purpose of keeping the interior dry, far more so than the roofs formed of bark or boards, through which the rain will find entrance. Sometimes the shanty has a window, sometimes only an open doorway, which admits the light and lets out the smoke. A rude chimney, which is often nothing better than an opening cut in one of the top logs above the hearth, a few boards fastened in a square form, serves as a vent for the smoke, the only precaution against the fire catching the log walls behind the hearth being a few large stones placed in a half-circular form, or more commonly, a bank of dry earth raised against the wall. Nothing can be more comfortless than some of these shanties, reeking with smoke and dirt, the common receptacle for children, pigs, and fowls. But I have given you the dark side of this picture. I am happy to say all the shanties on the squatter's ground were not like these. On the contrary, by far the larger proportion were inhabited by tidy folks, and had one or even two small windows, and a clay chimney regularly built up through the roof. Some were even roughly floored, and possessed similar comforts with the small log houses. You will, perhaps, think it strange when I assure you that many respectable settlers, with their wives and families, persons delicately nurtured, and accustomed to every comfort before they came hither, have been contented to inhabit a hut of this kind during the first or second year of their settlement in the woods. I have listened with feelings of great interest to the history of the hardships endured by some of the first settlers in the neighborhood. When Peterborough contained but two dwelling houses, when Peterborough contained but two dwelling houses, then there were neither roads cut nor boats built for communicating with the distant and settled parts of the district. Consequently, The difficulties of procuring supplies of provisions was very great, beyond what beyond what anyone that has lately come hither can form any notion of. When I heard of a whole family having had no better supply of flour than what could be daily ground by a small hand mill, and for weeks being destitute of every necessity, not even excepting bread, I could not help expressing some surprise, never having met with any account in the works I have read concerning emigration that at all prepared one for such evils. These particular trials, observed my intelligent friend, are confined principally to the first breakers of the soil in the unsettled parts of the country, as was our case. If you diligently question some of the families of the lower class that are located far from the towns, and who had little or no means to support them during the first 12 months, till they could take a crop off the land, you'll hear many sad tales of distress. Writers on emigration do not take the trouble of searching out these things, nor does it answer their purpose to state disagreeable facts. Few have written exclusively on the bush. Travelers generally make a hasty journey through the long settled and prosperous portions of the country. They see attractive, fertile, well cultivated land, the result of many years of labor. They see comfortable dwellings, abounding with all the substantial necessities of life. The farmer's wife makes her own soap, candles, and sugar. The family are clothed and cloth of their own spinning, and hose of their own knitting. The bread, the beer, butter, cheese, meat, poultry, etc., are all the produce of the farm. He concludes, therefore, that Canada is the land of Canaan, and writes a book setting forth these advantages, with the addition of obtaining land for a mere song, and advises all persons who would be independent and secure from want to emigrate. He forgets that these advantages are the result of long years of unremitting and patient labor, that these things are the crown, not the first fruits, of the settler's toil, and that during the interval many and great privations must be submitted to by almost every class of emigrants. Many persons, on first coming out, especially if they go back into any of the unsettled townships, are dispirited by the unpromising appearance of things about them. They find none of the advantages and comforts of which they had heard and read, and they are unprepared for the present difficulties. Some give way to despondency, and others quit the place in disgust. A little reflection would have shown them that every rood of land must be cleared of the thick forest of timber that encumbers it before an ear of wheat can be grown, that, after the trees have been chopped, cut into lengths, drawn together or logged, as we call it, and burned, the field must be fenced, the seed sown, harvested, and thrashed before any returns can be obtained. That this requires time and much labor, and if hired labor, considerable outlay of ready money. And in the meantime, a family must eat. If at a distance from a shore, every article must be brought through every article must be brought through bad roads, either by hand or with a team, the hire of which is generally costly in proportion to the distance and difficulty to be encountered in the conveyance. Now these things are better known beforehand, and then people are aware what they have to encounter. Even a laboring man, though he have his land of his own, is often, I may say generally, obliged to hire out to work for the first year or two, to earn sufficient for the maintenance of his family. And even so, many of them suffer much privation before they can reap the benefit of their independence. Were it not for the hope and the certain prospect of bettering their condition ultimately, they would sink under what they have to endure. But this thought buoys them up. They do not fear an old age of want and pauperism. The present evils must yield to industry and perseverance. They think also for their children, and the trials of present time are lost in pleasing anticipations for the future. Surely, said I, cows and pigs and poultry might be kept. And you know where there is plenty of milk, butter, cheese, and eggs, with pork and fowls, persons cannot be very badly off for food. Very true, replied my friend, but I must tell you it is easier to talk of these things at first than to keep them, unless on cleared or partially cleared farms. But we are speaking of a first settlement in the backwoods. Cows, pigs, and fowls must eat, and if you have nothing to give them unless you purchase it, and perhaps have to bring it from some distance, you had better not be troubled with them, as the trouble is certain and the profit doubtful. A cow, it is true, will get her living during the opening months of the year in the bush, but sometimes she will ramble away for days together, and then you lose the use of her, and possibly much time in seeking her. Then, then in the winter, she requires some additional food to the browse, to the browse that she gets during the tropic season, or 10 to 1, but she dies before spring, and cows generally lose their milk during the winter, if not very well kept. It is best to part with them in the fall and buy again in the spring, unless you have plenty of food for them, which is not often the case the first winter. As to pigs, they are great plagues on a newly cleared farm if you cannot fat them offhand, and that you cannot do without you buy food for them, which does not answer to do it first. If they run loose, they are a terrible annoyance both to your own crops and your neighbors, if you happen to be within half a mile of one. For though you may fence out cattle, you cannot pigs. Even poultry requires something more than they pick up about the dwelling to be of any use, to be of any service to you, and are often taken off by hawks, eagles, foxes, and polecats, till you have proper securities for them. Then, how are we to spin our own wool and make our own soap and candles? Said I. When you are able to kill your own sheep, pigs, when you're able to kill your own sheep and hogs and oxen, unless you buy wool and tallow, uh, wait, sorry. Then how are we to spin our own wool and make our own soap and candles? Said I. When you're when you're able to kill your own sheep and hogs and oxen, unless you buy wool and tallow, then, seeing you begin to look somewhat disappointed, he said, "Be not cast down. You will have all these things in time, and more than these, never fear, if you have patience, and use the means of obtaining them. In the in the meanwhile, prepare your time, prepare your mind for many probations to which at present you are a stranger, and if you would desire to see your husband happy and prosperous, be content to use economy, and above all, be cheerful. In a few years, the farm will supply you with all the necessaries of life, and by you may even enjoy many of the luxuries. Then it is then it is that a settler begins to taste the real and solid advantages of his emigration. Then he feels the blessings of a country where there are no taxes, tids, nor poor rates. Then he truly feels the benefit of independence. It is looking forward to this happy fulfillment of his desires that makes the rough path smooth, and lightens the burden of present ills. He looks round He looks round a numerous family without those anxious fears that beset a father in moderate circumstances at home, for he know for he knows he does not have them for he knows he does not leave them destitute of an honest means of support. In spite of all the trials he had encountered, I found this gentleman was so much attached to a settler's life that he declared he would not go back to his own country to reside for a permanence on any account. Nor is he the only one that I have heard express the same opinion, and it likewise seems the universal one among the lower class of immigrants. They are encouraged by the example of others, whom they see enjoying comforts that they could never have obtained had they labored ever so hard at home, and they wisely reflect they must have had hardships to endure had they remained in their native land. Many indeed have been driven out by want, without the most remote chance of bettering themselves or becoming the possessors of land free from all the restrictions. What to us are the sufferings of 1, 2, 3, or even 4 years, compared with a whole life of labor and poverty? Was the remark of a poor laborer who was recounting to us the other day some of the hardships he had met with in his country. He said he knew they were only for a short time, and that by industry he should soon get over them. I have already seen two of our poor neighbors that left the parish a twelvemonth ago. They are settled in Canada Company lots, and are getting on well. They have some few acres cleared and chopped, but are obliged to hire out to enable their families to live, working on their own land when they can. The men are in good spirits, and say they shall in a few years have many comforts about them that they never could have got at home, had they worked late and early. But they complain that their wives are always pining for home, and lamenting that they ever crossed the seas. This seems to be the general complaint with all classes. Women are discontented and unhappy. Few enter with their whole heart into a settler's life. They miss the little domestic comforts that they had been used to enjoy. They regret the friends and relations they left in the old country, and they cannot endure the loneliness of the backwoods of the backwoods or of the backwoods. I'm not sure about the intonation there. All right. This prospect does not discourage me. I know I shall find plenty of occupation within doors, and I have sources of enjoyment when I walk abroad that will keep me from being dull. Besides, have I not a right to be cheerful and contented for the sake of my Besides, have I not a right to be cheerful and contented for the sake of my beloved partner? The change is not greater for me than him, and if for his sake I voluntarily left home and friends and country, shall I the change is not greater for me than him, and if for his sake I voluntarily left home and friends and country, shall I therefore sadden him by useless regrets? I am always inclined to subscribe to that sentiment of my favorite poet, Goldsmith. Still to ourselves in every place consigned, our own felicity we make or find. But I shall very soon be put to the test, as we leave this town tomorrow by 10 o'clock. The purchase of the lake lot is concluded. There are 3 acres chopped and a shanty up, but the shanty is not a habitable dwelling, being merely an open shed that was put up by the choppers as a temporary shelter, so we shall have to build a house. Late enough, late enough we are, too late to get in a full crop. Late enough we are, too late to get in the full crop, as the land is merely chopped, not cleared, and it is too late now to log and burn to long and bird the fallow, and get the seed wheat in. But it will be ready for spring crops. We paid $5.50 per acre for this lot. This was rather high for a wild land, so far from a town, and in a scantily settled part of the township, but the situation is good, and has a water frontage, for which my husband was willing to pay something more than if the lot had been further inland. In all probability, it will be some time before I find leisure again to take up my pen. We shall remain guests with blank till our house is in a habitable condition, which I suppose will be about Christmas. All right, and that concludes letter 6. So this is page 106 out of around 300. And I think I'm quite tired today, so I think I will leave off there. So probably next time I will continue from letter 7, and perhaps if I can go another 100 pages. So I guess in total I could do this in 3 sittings with 100 pages each. But yeah, I think I've reached my limit for today. So I hope whoever is listening or whoever will listen to this enjoys it. And also apologies for any words I mispronounce. Some of these words I'm not 100% familiar with, so pardon that. Alright then, I will end the stream here. Thank you for listening.